The WEF, with the cooperation of the UN, the WHO, and many federal governments around the world, including Canada, wants to implement central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, and a social credit system in order to have totalitarian control over the world. And it appears that Canada may be at the forefront of collaborating federal governments in attempting to implement this. Taken individually, the facts I'm about to show you may seem innocent, but seen as a whole, they may be anything but innocent. How is Canada working toward abolishing the current economic system in favor of CBDCs? How do the globalists plan to force this control mechanism on all of us? And who are the major players in Canada cooperating with the WEF? Recently, an alert viewer brought to my attention a clause in the Canadian Bank Act which would allow for the dissolution of all Canadian commercial banks, both domestic and foreign, by 2025. Section 21.1 of the Act reads, "Subject to subsections 2 and 4, banks shall not carry on business, and authorized foreign banks shall not carry on business in Canada after June 30th, 2025. This section may be more innocent than it appears, or it may not. I reached out to several financial experts I know in regards to this. Two of them were as alarmed as I was. However, Brett Oland, who is CEO of Bow Valley Credit Union, felt that the clause was there only to ensure that Parliament would regularly update the Act. In this, he may be correct, at least as far as its original intent. The government provides archived copies of the Act with all revisions going back to 2003. The Act is often updated several times every year. I went through all of them, and indeed a similar section does appear in each. However, that is not the end of the story. Not by a long way. As you can see, originally the clause did not provide a specific date, but read, "Subject to subsection 2, banks shall not carry on business and authorized foreign banks shall not carry on business in Canada after the day that is 5 years after this section comes into force." It could easily be argued that a date can be calculated from this, so the appearance of actual dates may not be sinister in and of itself. Or it might be, as a specific date can't be debated, whereas the 5-year time limit is somewhat vague. However, note that for the 12 years of available records prior to Justin Trudeau's election in 2015, a specific date was used only once, for 3 revisions of the Act starting in 2006 and extending into early 2007, when once again Section 21.1 returned to a 5-year deadline after the Act was amended. But very shortly after Trudeau's election, a specific date once again appeared, March 29, 2019. This persisted through 6 revisions of the Act. Then, once again, there was no specific date mentioned until mid-2021. This could be innocent coincidence, or perhaps not. Shortly prior to the return of a specific date, June 30th, 2025, the date which remains in the most recent revision, Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England and a graduate of the WEF's Young Global Leaders Program, was appointed the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. Throughout this report, note the connection between the climate change narrative and finance or banking. Mark Carney has also been pegged as the #1 contender to replace Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party, despite having no prior experience as a politician. Shortly after that appointment, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, was appointed Minister of Finance by Justin Trudeau. Freeland has 0 experience in finance. Her only degree is in Slavonic studies. Clearly, she is completely unqualified for the job, so why was she appointed to this position? Trudeau and Freeland are also graduates of the WEF's Young Global Leaders Program, and both Freeland and Carney sit on the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. Then in 2021, Peter Rutledge was appointed Superintendent of the Office of Financial Institutions, or OSFI, for a period of 7 years. Prior to this, Rutledge served as a senior advisor at the Department of Finance and Chief Executive Officer of Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation, or CDIC, the agency which insures depositors at Canadian banks. While I could find no direct connections between Rutledge and the WEF, he certainly sings their song, linking the banking sector to the climate change narrative and appearing several times before parliamentary committees to provide advice on green finance and digital innovation. In just one of many interviews and speeches Rutledge has given, he said, "Climate change will alter the cash flows generated by some capital assets and occasionally trigger noticeable changes in valuation. These capital asset valuation changes may be felt unevenly across OSFI's regulated constituency. The digitalization of financial services will affect all business models and threaten an unknowable few. The rising incidence of cyber attacks across the globe add to the volatility produced by digitalization." This statement is far more significant than it might appear at first glance. We'll revisit it later. What powers does Rutledge have? An article on the Tory Law website reads, "Another key feature of Part 2 is 21.1, which presents a sunset clause for the Act, a feature which is more or less unique to banking." And I would add, unique to Canada. I checked both the UK and US Bank Acts and could find no sunset clause. An internet search asking for sunset clauses in the Bank Act of any country other than Canada also returned no results. Section 21.1 requires Parliament to pass new legislation within a given period to ensure the continuity of the Act and the business it permits. If the sunset date passes, Canadian banks and authorized foreign bank branches must cease business within Canada. And like other sunset clauses, this notionally ensures that the Bank Act is reviewed regularly. However, the sunset date can be and has been moved by Acts of Parliament, such as with Bill C-30, which received royal assent in 2021 and pushed back the sunset date for the Bank Act to June 30th, 2025. This statement is factual and summarizes some of the points I've already covered. While the Act would have been due for revision no later than 2023, the mentioned bill did push the date back to June 2025. Another bill, C-47, which received royal assent in June of last year, expands the powers of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, the office of which Peter Rutledge is now in charge. Division 33 of Part 4 amends the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions Act, the Trust and Loan Companies Act, the Bank Act, and the Insurance Companies Act to, among other things, A. Expand the mandate of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions to include the supervision of federal financial institutions, that is to say, commercial banks, in order to determine whether they have adequate policies and procedures to protect themselves against threats to their integrity or security, and B. Expand the Superintendent of Financial Institutions' powers to issue directions to and take control of a federal financial institution in certain circumstances. In short, it gives Peter Rutledge dictatorial powers over the banking system at all commercial banks. And if you think that's far-fetched, OSFI, last year, seized all Canadian assets of the failed Silicon Valley Bank. So all that is needed for Rutledge to seize control of any or all Canadian commercial banks is a sufficiently dire emergency in which he could determine, in his role as superintendent, that the bank or banks do not have adequate policies or procedures to protect themselves against threats to their integrity or security in order to take control of them. And remember that Rutledge used to be CEO of the CBDC, or Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation, so he could easily claim that the banks represent a risk to depositors, a risk that could not be covered by the CBDC if the bank were to fail. And that's an easy one, as the CBDC does not have nearly enough assets to cover all Canadian deposits. So, if indeed Rutledge is working in conjunction with Trudeau, Carney, Freeland, and other WEF-controlled politicians in the Liberal cabinet, how would they manufacture such an emergency? To access the rest of this report with no cost or obligation, sign up for a free 15-day full access trial at ironwillreport.com. You will not be asked for your credit card information, and you will be granted instant access. We release 2 exclusive interviews every week, as well as a half-hour counter-narrative news show every Friday. Memberships support our work at strongandfreecanada.org to recover and defend our rights and freedoms. Get the truth that mainstream media won't report and our government doesn't want you to hear.